Ya, esta es la clase del 25 de junio del grupo 2 de la UMCE. Estamos revisando variations in the verb phrases. Y ayer, estoy haciendo el resumen de ayer. Ayer revisamos la idea de tense, la idea de aspect. ¿Sí? Entonces hoy día continuamos con lo que queda, que sería voice, modality y finiteness, non-finiteness. ¿Me escuchan bien, cierto?
Sí, profe.
Ya, muchas gracias. Okay, let's do it. So we're going to begin with the idea of voice. So voice, I'm going to read it and then I'm going to explain quite a little bit. Voice, most transitive verbs can occur in two voices, active and passive. Okay. The active is most common, is the unmarked version of it. And the passive voice constructions are less common. Passive voice reduce the importance of the agent, the doer. Okay, so what we're saying is this. In the English language, within the English language, in the verb phrase, in the English verb phrase, you can create some variations inside of them. Yesterday, we discussed the idea of tense, the idea of aspect, now the idea of modality. The very first thing we have to say is, well, first of all, that okay, in black, estamos dejando entrar gente. In black, the very first thing would be provide an example, right? I buy this, right? So what we have there is a common clause made out of three phrases, one verb phrase, right? Therefore, the verbal part, one noun phrase performing the role of a subject, and finally, another noun phrase, which is the receiver of the action of the verb, therefore, is the object. Therefore, the valency pattern is SVO. Okay, I talked about valency pattern, right? Valency pattern. Ya hemos hablado harto de esto. A valency pattern is the patterns in which the English clause is being built, and there are, I mean, there are a close number of them. So you can have a subject verb, a subject verb object, subject verb object object, subject verb complement, subject verb object complement, subject verb adverbial, right? The valency patterns, they have, I would say, members, I would say parts, I would say units, and they are called subject, which is the doer of the action, right? The symbol is capital S. Then we'll have the verbal part. Some people call them verb. Then we also have the object, capital O. Then the complement, capital C. And finally the adverbial, capital A. Then the subject is the doer of the action. The verbal part is the action itself. The object is the receiver of the action. The complement is when is a unit which adds information about the subject or the object. Therefore, they characterize, right? Uh, info. I would say info about the subject and or the object. And finally, the adverbial is a unit which provides information about the place, the time, etc. Okay, let's go back to the sentence. I buy this. We have the action buy, we have the doer of the action, therefore the subject I, and then we have the receiver of the action, therefore another noun phrase, but in this case is an object, right? The passive voice then is a change within the verb phrase so as to provide another change, a change in meaning. In grammar terms, you will move the object into subject position, and then you will provide a change inside of the verb phrase by the presence of the verb to be and an ed2 form of the main verb, right? Um, Finally, and in some cases, usually the doer, the original subject is being erased, omitted, right? But you can also put them as an optional unit, right? And also with a change in the form, right? So in the analysis, then we will see that there is a change in that there is a change in the clause pattern. I mean, in the clause units, but not in the pattern, right? So the very first one is still the noun phrase subject. The second one is still the verb phrase verb, and then the final one is a prepositional phrase acting as an object. What we did is this: we take the receiver of the action, and we put it as the doer of the action, right? Um, Grammarians, they have called this voice, right? The very first, the unmarked form, is called the active voice, and the second one, the marked version, is called the passive voice. Okay. Do you know how to do this? Did Have you ever seen this before, like in English language or at school or something?
Sí lo vemos, pero de una manera más sencilla, por así decirlo.
Marcelo, es exactamente la misma idea. Es la misma idea, solo que ahora lo que les estoy proporcionando son un par de términos. And the terms are: inside of a clause, you have a valency pattern, and the subject is the doer, the ones which performs the action of the verb, right? Now, in that's active voice. In passive voice, what you do is to take the object, that is to say, the receiver of the action, and then put that stuff at the very beginning as the subject. But once you do that, you have to create a change in the verb phrase, right? It is extremely important that you understand that not every single verb is capable of doing this. You need one specific type of verb. Those verbs are called transitive verbs. Transitive verb. Transitive verbs, they come they come from the concept transitiveness, which means the capacity for a verb to have an object, right? The capacity for a verb to move the action towards a receiver, right? I'm going to spend a little time on this. There are many verbs, right? And we're talking about lexical verbs, main verbs, right? Main verbs can be classified into different forms. They can be classified because or by no, they can be classified whether they have the capacity for moving the action towards an object, right? Right. Therefore, if they can't move the action, therefore, in other words, if they can't take an object, they are called intransitive, right? If they can move the action, if they can move the action towards one single object, they are called monotransitive. If they can move the action towards two objects, they are called detransitive. And if they can move the action towards an object and an adverbial, They are called complex transitive. I'm going to prove this by using the Cambridge Online Dictionary. Okay, in the within the English within the Cambridge Online Dictionary, I'm going to search for the verb buy, which is the one we were using in our example. And now we're going to see this. Buy is a verb. It's being pronounced in British English and in American English is irregular because they provide us with the two different forms, the ED1 and the ED2, and then they say A1, I, or T, which means I'm going to click on that verbs. T means transitive verbs, un verbo que tiene un objeto directo. I, verbo intransitivo, un verbo que no tiene objeto directo. Therefore, the verb buy is a transitive or intransitive verb. It will depend on what? On the context. So, for example, as a result of this, in this example, both of them, the verb buy is transitive because it takes a direct object, an object, right? But on the other hand, uh, if I write just like that, right, right, I buy and nothing more, right? In that case, the verb buy would be intransitive because there is no direct object. Okay. What I want to say with this is the following: is you will find verbs which can be transitive or intransitive, right? Uh, that description will depend on the context in which they are placed, right? Do you understand that? ¿Se entiende, no?
¿Lo podría repetir?
Um, in English, you will find verbs which can be classified as both transitive or intransitive. How can I know when is one or the other? Well, because of the presence of an object, right? I want to spend a little bit more time explaining what an object is. An object is a unit at the level of the clause, which is usually a noun phrase, right? And that noun phrase can be found by asking the question what or who, right? So you can find this stuff by asking what or who. So for example, I buy this. What do I buy? This. Therefore, this is the receiver of the action, therefore is an object, right? In the second example, this was bought by me. What was bought? No, who bought this, right? Me. Therefore, by me, that prepositional phrase is the receiver of that action. Another way in which you can find, or not another way, but another proof of an object is that an object is an entity placed right after the verb, right? So therefore, as entities are represented by nouns, what you're looking for is a noun phrase. A noun phrase following the verb is usually an object. ¿Se entiende? Espero que sí.
Sí, sí, entiendo. Bueno,
Okay. So, voice is another way in which you can vary a verb phrase in English, right? Right. Voice, passive voice. Most are formed with the auxiliary verb be and ed participle. Yeah, so the way in which you build a passive voice is by using the verb to be plus the main verb in ed2, right? Right. You can also form passive voice with the auxiliary verb get. So you can replace the verb be by the verb get, and you have the very same result. The passive voice is possible with most transitive verbs. Okay? The subject noun phrase in the passive sentence usually corresponds to the direct object in the equivalent active voice sentence. It is basically the very same stuff I was saying. Okay, modals and semi-modals. Now we are going to move to another variation, modality. There are 9 central modal verbs in English. Okay, they call them central modal verbs. Why? Because you have semi-modals. Okay? Okay, central modal verbs in English. They are can, could, may, might, must, should, will, would, and shall. Okay? They act as an auxiliary verb in verb phrases. We know that from the previous test. They do not take inflections to show agreement or tense. We know that from the previous test. They precede the negative particle in not negation. We know that from the previous test. They precede the subject in yes, no questions, and we know that from the previous test as well. They take a bare infinitive. I'm going to make this stuff smaller. Okay, got it. They take a bare infinitive verb as the main verb in the verb phrase. Okay, yeah, we know that from the previous test as well. Modal verbs and semi-modals. Semi-modals are also called periphrastic modals or quasi-modals. Why periphrastic modals? Is it that well? That's something I explained yesterday. And periphrasis or a periphrastic construction happens when, as you can't put an inflection on some item, then in order to express that grammatical meaning, you are going to use another item in front of that, right? So I'm going to make a quick summary of it. Um, okay, so this is voice, right? And now I'm going to talk about modality, right? In terms of modality, then we can state that it can be done by the presence of two different items, uh, central modals and semi-modals, right? Right. Semi-modals and central modals, they can be inflected, right? Right. Therefore, what they produce is a periphrastic construction. I'm going to explain this. A periphrastic construction, then, is the presence of an item which will provide a grammatical information about the following item. Therefore, when you use a central modal, like in this example, you have a periphrastic construction because the presence of the central modal will is only there to produce the idea of future meaning for the main verb play, right? The same happens with semi-modals. Okay, I'm going to use another one to make it more similar, right? Like in be going to play. The semi-modal be going to is there just to produce the sense of future meaning on the main verb play. Therefore, both of them are called periphrastic constructions, right? Modals then is a way in which you are going to add meaning to the verbs when you can't inflect them. And that's important. Please remember that. Multi-word constructions that functions like modal verbs are had better, have to, have got to, ought to, be supposed to, be going to, and used to. Nothing new. Time distinctions with modals and semi-modals. The central modals can be used to make time distinctions even though they are not marked for tense. And that's the reason why they are that's the reason why denme un segundo, chiquillos. Entonces, ¿qué estábamos? Time distinctions with modals and semi-modals. The central modals can be used to make time distinctions even though they are not marked for tense. Yeah, you can use them to show some kind of timed reference, and that's why they're when once you find a verb phrase with a modal verb inside of it, that verb phrase is considered to be tensed, therefore finite, right? That's the reason. Because why? Well, mostly because modal verbs, they have some kind of reference to time. It is possible to group the central modals except must into pairs with related meaning that sometimes distinguish past time and non-past time. So you have this chart. Modal verbs referring to present and future time, corresponding modals that can refer to past time, and that's the very same idea. Therefore, some people say that modal verbs have a present or a past form, but that's not true, I think. Um, they just some kind refer to one of those times, right? So I won't pay much attention to this, even though you should know that, right? um, Typical meaning distinctions for modals and semi-modals. The main function is related to stance, that is to say, the expression of possibility and obligation. So I would say that modal verbs are more related to the idea of obligation in a continuum than to the idea of time, which means that there are going to be modal verbs which are more certain than others. So, for example, if you say could, it's less certain than saying, I don't know, must, right? Must would be the top of it. So, modals that are associated with past times are also used for hypothetical situations with present or future reference. So, for example, could I sit here for a minute has a present reference, right? Because the action is happening at the moment of speaking. Could you sing one of these two, right? That's more hypothetical, right? Therefore, the very same modal verb can be used in order to express different ideas. Modals combined with aspect and voice. Modals cannot combine with tense, which means you can't have something like he can plays, right? That's impossible. But you can mix modal verbs with aspect and voice. So let's take these examples. Modal verb with perfect aspect. The demand for subject access may have come as a shock to the library profession. So we have the verb phrase may have come with the presence of the central modal may, and the perfective aspect have come, right? So you can actually mix them. Second thing, modal with progressive aspect, the very same idea. Nancy will be coming, right? So you have the verb phrase will be coming where with the modal verb will and the progressive aspect becoming. Modal with passive voice, the same idea. Should be supplied and it works in the very same manner. So basically you can mix them. You can mix modality, aspect. You can mix tense and aspect. Sequences of modals and semi-modals. The semi-modals have to and be going to can occur in a series following another modal or semi-modal. They will have to quit. So in that case, you have two some kind of modal verbs together, but you have a central modal and then a semi-modal. The same with I'm going to have it, to have to. I'm going to have to say, right? In this case, we have this colloquial, right? This slang, I would say, but it's not a slang anymore. I would say, yeah, everyday language. I'm gonna have to say. Okay. Any questions about modality? No. Okay. Finite and non-finite. The S form and the past form are called finite, whereas the ing participle and the ed participle are called non-finite. Why? Because the S form and the past form, that is to say, the inflection provided by the bound morpheme, the suffix set to and the suffix ed1, they clearly refer to a past and a present time, right? Meanwhile, the ing participle and the ed2, right? The ing suffix and the ed2 suffix, they can't provide that reference. In a finite verb phrase, only the first verb word is finite. Therefore, in the example, she calls him every day, the verb phrase calls is finite. Why? Because of the presence of the Z2 suffix in the verb head. But what happens if I have more than one verb? Then the tense is shown by the first auxiliary verb. In the second example, she's calling me now. Then the tense is present in the very first auxiliary verb. In this case, the verb to be in its third person singular form. The same happens with the third example. She has called twice today. The tense is expressed by the first auxiliary verb has by the presence of the Z2 suffix. Finite and non-finite. In a non-finite verb phrase, all verbs are non-finite. That is to say, all verbs are written by using ing or ed2. So, for example, calling early, she found him at home. Calling early then is a non-finite clause, and that non-finite clause has a verb phrase, a non-finite verb phrase, with the verb head calling. Calling is non-finite because it's written in the ing participle. The same happens with the second example, but in this case, not with the ing participle, but with the ed2 participle. The third example is the one which is more interesting because you have a complex verb phrase with two auxiliary verbs and one main verb, and any of them is finite. Why? Because they are written in ing participle, the first one, ed2, the rest of them, the two of them. Okay. Why is this important? This is important because, as well as yesterday, having been called early, okay, I'm going to provide an analysis for that. Being called early, he felt sleepy all day. Okay, I'm going to try to provide a syntactic analysis for this. The very first stuff is looking for the main verb. Now, question: where's the main verb? What's the main verb? The main verb is felt. How do I know that? Because felt is the one providing the valency pattern. How do I know that? Because it's the one which is following a subject, right? Who felt sleepy? Okay, it's he, therefore, this is the subject. How did he feel? He feels sleepy. He felt sleepy when? All day. And then you have having been called early is a clause, right? Okay. This is a noun phrase and doer of the action, therefore subject. This is a verb phrase, an action, therefore verbal. How did he feel? Sleepy. If I ask how, then I'm asking information about the subject, right? Therefore, sleepy is there just to characterize the subject. As a consequence, this is a subject complement. Sleepy is an adjective phrase, right? And all day is a noun phrase, right? Noun phrase acting as or answering the question when, therefore is an adverbial of time. He is a pronoun, therefore head. Felt is a verb head. Sleepy, as I said before, is an adjective, therefore head. And all day, all is a determiner, pre-modifier, and then day is a noun head. Now, what we have over there? We have having been called early. I know that verb phrases are created around verbs, and I can see three of them having been called. Therefore, that's the verb phrase. When early, so I have something else. This is a non-finite. What's what's the form of the first verb? Ing. Therefore, ing clause, right? Where I have this verb phrase, which is the verbal part of it, and this early, when early, that's an adverb, I think. Therefore, it must be an adverb phrase acting as an adverbial of time. This verb phrase is created by three different verbs having been called. Having is an auxiliary verb, pre-modifier. Been is another auxiliary verb, pre-modifier, and been and called would be my verb head. Early then is an adverb head. The valency pattern for this clause would be an, an adverbial, a subject, verb, a subject, subject complement, and then an adverbial. Any question? Any question?
Profe,
Dígame.
¿podría repetir como lo que hizo desde el having hasta early, por favor?
Perdón, de nuevo, no lo escucho bien.
¿Podría repetir de nuevo lo que, como, a ver, cómo hizo desde having a early?
Ya. Lo primero que voy a decir es que the very first stuff I'm going to say is non-finite verbs, they have forms. They can be of two different types. They can be ing, they can be ed2, right? Right. Non-finite verbs, they will create non-finite clauses, right? Right. Then, uh, these non-finite clauses, they will provide, or they will play a role inside of another clause, right? In this case, in this example, is an adverbial of manner, right? Um, Inside of a non-finite clause, there is a verb phrase. That verb phrase is represented by the non-finite verbs, right? In this case, having been called is a verb phrase, right? A non-finite verb phrase. As in any other verb phrase, the last verb is the main verb, the verb head, and all the other ones are auxiliary verbs, right? Therefore, in my analysis, I put that, right? The last verb is the verb head, and then the other two are just auxiliary verbs pre-modifying. Then early, early, that word is not working with the higher clause, but inside of the non-finite clause, right? Therefore, early tells me when this action is happening, right? Which action? The non-finite action, right? Therefore, it's an adverb phrase, adverbial of time, and inside of that, there's just an adverb head. And that's all. No sé si queda claro. ¿Queda claro?
Yo tengo una pregunta.
Dígame.
Entonces, las non-finite eh, phrases, por así decir, clauses,
Clauses.
clauses, eso mismo. Eso mismo, se clasifican solamente cuando el primer verbo es con ing o ed2. Eso
Excelente,
mismo.
muy bien. Excelente, sí. Pueden ser, hay non-finite, pueden ser cuatro en verdad. O sea, sí, pueden ser cuatro. Hay más, pero por ahora. Las más comunes son ing, non-finite ing clause, si es que el primer verbo es ing, non-finite ed clause if the first verb is ed, non-finite true infinitive clause if the first verb is a true infinitive, and in some cases, really weird, you can have non-finite bare infinitive, but that's really, really weird. I would say also there's a fifth one called verbless clauses where you have a clause without a verb, but that's very strange. But the most common ones are non-finite ing, non-finite ed clauses. ¿Más preguntas? No, avanzo. Okay, having been called, then finite and non-finite. The base form, main verb, occurs as a finite form in present form, imperative, present subjunctive, and past form. Okay, what are we talking about? We're talking about the base form. What's the base form? The base form is the bare infinitive. Do you remember the different forms verbs can have? Right? Okay, verb forms. This was part of the previous test. They can be base form. They can be S form. They can be ed form. They can be ing form. Right? Right. So play, plays, played, playing, right? The base form, main verb, occurs as a finite form in, right? So the base form, play, esa forma, occurs as a finite or is considered to be finite when it is used as present, imperative, present subjunctive, past form. That's explanation. And is considered to be non-finite in bare infinitive, to infinitive, ing participle, ed participle, the passive following the be. I don't like any of these explanations. I would say the following. A verb is considered to be finite when it is used to represent any of these names. Present simple, if you say present simple, you're saying present tense, right? If you say present continuous, present perfect, past simple, and so on and so forth, when you call the verb phrase to be used in that manner, then it's a clear proof that the verb is finite, right? Uh, if you see the verb in any other way, you will say that's non-finite. That's, I think, it's the best summary. We're going to review that once we do the analysis. Finite verb phrases. Finite verb phrases, therefore, verb phrases with where the main verb has tense, or the first auxiliary has tense, or the presence of a central modal verb, can occur as the verb phrase of independent clauses. Okay, we know that. Finite verb phrases have tense contrast, the distinction between present and past tenses. Contrast is very, very interesting. Contrast is a concept which allows us to compare, obviously, two items. When you say that there is a contrast, there is a number contrast in this and this another item, it means that one of them is plural and the other one is singular. Or if you say there is a tense contrast, then what you're saying that one of the items is present and the other one is the opposite, past, right? So that's interesting for you to know. Finite verb phrases will appear when there's a person and number concord. We already know that from the previous test. They contain as their first or only word a finite verb form, which may be an operator or a simple or past form. When you say operator, you're talking about the very first auxiliary verb. Do support this verb do when it's being used in the present simple or in the past simple tense is used in forming negative and interrogative constructions. Nothing new. Okay, finite verb phrases, they have mood. I won't say much about that. Mood means they are declarative, interrogative. Declarative, interrogative, interrogative, and that's it. Non-finite verb phrases. The infinitive to call, the ing participle calling, the ed participle called are the non-finite forms of the verb. We know that they are two infinitives. They are infinitives. To infinitive, to call, or bare infinitive, just call. They are ing participle, calling, or ed participle, called. That's the ed2. Are the non-finite form of the verbs. Any verb phrase in which one of these any verb phrase in which one of these verb forms is the first or only word is a non-finite verb phrase. Deme un segundo, chiquilla. Ya volví. Any verb phrase in which one of these verbs, any verb phrase in which one of these verb forms is the first or only word is a non-finite verb phrase. Any verb phrase in which one of these verb forms is the first or only word is a non-finite verb phrase. Okay, yeah, I already talked about that. So if you have a verb phrase which starts with a word waiting for an answer, then waiting is the non-finite verb, right? Because it's an ing form. Nothing new. Non-finite verb phrases do not normally occur as the verb phrase of an independent clause. No, they won't happen. It won't happen in that way. Non-finite verb phrases are for subordinate clauses, which means that are clauses inside of another clause, right? Just like the ones in the example I already told you. So here we have finally a chart. Finite verb phrases, all of these are finite verb phrases. He smokes. The verb phrase is smokes, where we have a main verb, one single verb, and that verb is in its S form, Z2. Mary is having a smoke is another finite verb phrase. The verb phrase is having. How do I know that? Because of the presence of the first auxiliary verb with a tense, Z2. He must smoke 40 a day. Must smoke is a finite verb phrase because of the presence of a modal verb. You have been smoking all day is finite because of the presence of the base form in the present simple, in the present, right? Have. Non-finite verb phrases, for example, to smoke like that must be dangerous. There you have to smoke, right? To smoke would be the verb phrase is non-finite because it is built by the to infinitive verb to smoke. In the second one, I regret having started to smoke. I regret having started to smoke. It's really weird and difficult. Having started to smoke. The verb phrase is having started to smoke and is non finite because it begins with the verb having, therefore, an ing form, an ing participle. The cigars smoked here tend to be expensive. The verb phrase, okay, we're going to do that. That's a good one. The cigars smoked here tend to be expensive. Okay, the cigars smoked here tend to be expensive. I must look for the verb phrase, right? The problem is I have two different verbs. So I have to ask myself which one of them is the main or the verb phrase that belongs to the. Deme un segundo, chiquillo. Yeah. The cigars smoked here tend to be expensive. And then what we have to do is looking for the verb phrase, but not any of because there are two of them, right? But we need to find the one that belongs to the main clause, right? The cigars smoked here tend to be expensive. They tend to be expensive, right? So tend should be the verb phrase. It begins over here. The problem is I have tend to be and I can see another verb over there. Therefore, tend is a semi-modal verb, right? Tend to be. This is the verb phrase verb. Then they tend to be. So therefore, this is the noun phrase subject, right? How they tend to be? They tend to be expensive, right? This is a unit which provides information about the cigars. Expensive is an adjective phrase, and as it is providing information about the subject, then it's a subject complement. Expensive is an adjective head, and then be is the verb head. Always the last verb is the verb head. Tend to is an auxiliary verb premodifier because is a semi-modal verb. The cigars smoked here. Then I can see the cigars smoked here. Smoked is a verb, right? It's in ed, right? Right, but it's inside of the noun phrase. So what I have is cigars as the noun head. D would be the determinate premodifier, and then smoked here is a clause, right? How do I know that? Because there's a verb phrase. Inside this clause is it will obtain its name from the verb phrase form, and this is an ed. So it's a non-finite ed clause, right? Performing the role of I suppose modifier. I think I can erase it. And inside of that, I have two different phrases: smoked, because this is a verb phrase, and here, which tells me where, right? Smoked is the verb phrase verb, non-finite always, made out of one single verb head, and here is an adverbial, another phrase, adverbial of place, right? Where, here, created by the adverb head here. And that's my analysis. The valency pattern then would be subject, verb, subject, complement. ¿Alguna pregunta de cómo es ese análisis? No? Okay. The cigars smoked here tend to be expensive. That was the last cigarette to have been smoked by me. The very same idea. That was the last cigarette to have been smoked but by me, right? To have been smoked by me would be a clause then with the non-finite verb phrase to have been smoked. Simple and complex verb phrases. Okay, here we have another content. The simple verb phrase is simple when it consists of only one word. Okay, therefore, he works hard. Works is a simple verb phrase. He worked hard, past. Worked is a simple verb phrase because it has only one single verb. The same with work harder, and with the last one, it is important that he worked hard, right? He worked hard is a subjunctive, and it's also one single verb, therefore a simple verb phrase. On the other hand, if you have a complex verb phrase, is when you have a verb phrase which consists of more than one word. The verb phrase is complex when it consists of two or more words. So, for example, John has worked hard. Has worked is the verb phrase, and it's complex because it consists of two verbs. John should be working is the very same idea, three verbs, and they may have been sold is the very same idea because they are four. I would add that a complex verb phrase is a verb phrase where you have an auxiliary verb. That's another definition for that. There are four basic types of constructions. Okay, complex verb phrases, and this is the way in which we are going to analyze a verb phrase now. There are four basic types of constructions. Type A, modal, modal auxiliary plus be form. There, okay, verb phrases, they can be analyzed whether they have these variations. Variations are modal, perfective aspect, progressive aspect, passive voice, right? Right. These variations will have a letter in order to signal them. Therefore, letter A goes for modal, letter B goes for perfective, letter C goes for progressive, letter D goes for passive voice. Therefore, a finite verb phrase can be analyzed by using these letters. And as a consequence, you have this chart. This is the summary. These are the only possible ways in which you can write a verb phrase, a finite verb phrase in English. And as you can see, you can begin with A, with B, with C, right? And there is a progression of that, right? You can have a B, a C, a D, right? Which means that those are the ways in which modal verbs can be combined with A, modal verb, B, progressive aspect, perfective aspect. The second one, AC, A plus progressive aspect, AD will be modal plus passive voices and all their possible combinations. Non-finite verb phrases, complex verb phrases, they have no tense or mood distinctions, we know that, and can occur in a construction with a subject of a main clause, we know that. He was doing it easily is finite, and he doing it easily is non-finite. Why the second is non-finite? Because there's no auxiliary verb, there's no modal verb, and that's it. Modal auxiliaries have no non-finite forms. Modals are always finite. Therefore, the ways in which you can write a verb phrase in English are non-finite verb phrases in English are these ones. ¿Alguna pregunta? ¿No? Maravilloso. Terminamos súper temprano, qué bueno. Con esto, mis distinguidos, hemos terminado la parte de teoría de la prueba 3 y final, que será llevada a cabo el día 8 de julio. La próxima semana nos vamos a encontrar entonces para hacer ejercicios de esta teoría y análisis de frases verbales. ¿Alguna duda al respecto? Maravilloso.
En la parte
Eso
de
es todo.
desarrollo sería,
Dígame.
la parte de desarrollo sería así como es lo que estábamos haciendo en la clase, como analizar eh, como oraciones con frases con clases no finitas y finitas, como cosas así,
Exacto.
de cada
Demuestra
uno.
demuestra el tiro lo que tiene que agregar a su análisis sintáctico. Esto es lo que vamos a ver el próximo jueves. Estamos trabajando para usted. Esperemos que se abra. ¿Dónde está el análisis? Entonces, en la próxima prueba, cuando usted tenga su frase verbal, como la última que está abajo, might be understood, no sé si la alcanza a ver, usted tiene que entregar toda la información que aparece abajo de ella. Complex, AD, finite, iriform, past participle, passive voice.
No estaba compartiendo pantalla.
No estoy compartiendo pantalla, perdón, discúlpame. Lo hago al tiro. Ahí está, perdón. ¿Caché que might be understood es una frase verbal? Entonces, mi primera pregunta es, ¿el tipo de verb phrase es simple, complex, compound, o sea, si tiene un coordinador al medio, o discontinuous, si tiene un adverbio? Might be understood no tiene nada extraño, solo son tres verbos juntos, por lo tanto es complex. Luego, puedo decir que tiene un modal y tiene una voz pasiva. Por eso la letra A de modal y la letra D de voz pasiva. Debido a que tiene un modal, es finite. Y luego identifico, que es lo que está en naranjo, el main verb. Understood está en su ed form, es un past participle y se escribe así debido a que es una passive voice. Eso es lo que hay que hacer en el análisis sintáctico ahora. Pero eso lo trabajamos ya la próxima semana con los ejercicios que le dé. Y le envío también esta cosa a su correo. Eso. ¿Alguna otra duda?
Profe, algo nada que ver.
Dígame.
La compañera Octavia Salinas, que no estuvo hoy presente, me pidió